I never thought much about nicknames until Miles started calling me Birdie. It wasn't cute or clever or even particularly meaningful at first, and that's exactly why it mattered so much. Everyone else in my life called me Nathan or Nate, depending on how well they knew me. But Miles, he just looked at me one afternoon while we were studying in the library and said, "Hey Birdie, you gonna help me with this calculus problem or just keep staring out the window?" I'd been watching the trees outside, watching the way the light filtered through the leaves, and I guess he thought I looked like I wanted to fly away or something. The nickname stuck, but only between us. Only ever between us. We met during sophomore year at college, randomly assigned as lab partners in chemistry. I remember thinking he was probably going to be one of those guys who never showed up and left me to do all the work. But Miles proved me wrong within the first week. He was early to every lab session, always prepared, always ready, with some dry comment that made me laugh when I was stressed about getting the measurements right. He had this way of making everything feel less serious without actually being careless about it. We started studying together outside of class, first just for chemistry, then for other subjects, and eventually just because being around each other felt easy, in a way that most friendships don't. The thing about Miles calling me Birdie was that it felt like he saw something in me that no one else did. My family called me responsible. My other friends called me reliable. My professors called me focused. But Miles saw restlessness in me. He saw that part of me that wanted to break out of the careful path I'd always walked. When he said Birdie, it wasn't just a nickname. It was an acknowledgement that I wasn't just the studious guy who always turned his papers in early and never missed a deadline. There was something else in me. Something that wanted more than what I'd planned for myself. I started noticing things about Miles that I told myself were just normal friend observations. The way he pushed his hair back when he was concentrating. How his voice got softer when he talked about his younger sister. The fact that he always ordered his coffee with way too much sugar and then complained it was too sweet. I noticed that his eyes were more green than brown in certain light, and that he had a scar on his left hand from a skateboarding accident when he was 12. I noticed everything, and I kept telling myself it was because we spent so much time together that this was just what close friendship looked like. One night in late October, we were in my dorm room working on separate assignments, comfortable in that easy silence that had developed between us. My roommate was gone for the weekend, so we'd spread our stuff all over both desks and the floor. Miles was lying on my bed with his laptop balanced on his stomach, and I was at my desk, supposedly writing an essay for my English class, but mostly just listening to him breathe and wondering when I'd become the kind of person who found someone else's breathing patterns comforting. He suddenly said, "Birdie, you ever think about just dropping everything and going somewhere completely different?" I turned around in my chair to look at him, and he was staring at the ceiling, his face serious in a way it usually wasn't. "Like where?" I asked. He shrugged, still not looking at me. "I don't know. Anywhere. Somewhere nobody knows us and we could just figure out who we actually are instead of who everyone expects us to be." The way he said, "we," made my chest feel tight. I wanted to ask him what he meant, if he was including me in this hypothetical escape, because I was his friend or because I was something more, something neither of us had named yet. Instead, I said, "I think about it sometimes. Flying away." He turned his head then, looked right at me, with those eyes that I'd catalogued so carefully, and smiled. "That's why you're Birdie," he said softly. We held eye contact for what felt like forever, and I had to force myself to turn back to my laptop before I did something stupid like tell him that I'd go anywhere with him, that the person I was trying to figure out how to be included, being someone who could love him the way I was starting to realize I did. After that night, something shifted between us. Or maybe it had been shifting all along, and I was just finally letting myself see it. Miles started finding excuses to touch me. Casual things like nudging my shoulder when I said something funny, or grabbing my arm when he wanted to show me something on his phone. I started noticing that we sat closer together than we used to, our knees touching when we studied across from each other at the coffee shop we'd claimed as our spot. Every time he called me Birdie, it felt more intimate, like a secret language only we spoke. I found myself waiting for it, for that moment when he'd look at me and use the name that made me feel seen, in a way my actual name never had. November brought cold weather and the stress of midterms, and Miles and I practically lived in the library. One particularly brutal evening, after we'd both been studying for hours, he closed his laptop and said, "Come on, Birdie. We need a break before our brains melt." We walked to the convenience store off campus, bought terrible hot chocolate from the machine that never worked quite right, and ended up sitting on the steps of the old humanities building, even though it was freezing. Miles sat close enough that our shoulders pressed together, and I could feel his warmth through both our jackets. "You know what I like about you," he said suddenly, his breath making clouds in the cold air. My heart started racing, but I tried to keep my voice steady. "What?" He was quiet for a moment, looking out at the empty quad. "You never make me feel like I have to be anyone but exactly who I am. Everyone else, they have these expectations, you know. My parents want me to be responsible. My friends from home want me to be the same guy I was in high school. But you just let me be whoever I am in any given moment." I didn't know what to say to that, so I just sat there, hyper aware of every point where our bodies touched. Finally, I managed, "You do the same for me." He turned to look at me then, and we were so close I could see the tiny flecks of gold in his eyes. "Yeah?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "Yeah," I said. "That's why Birdie matters so much to me. You see parts of me I didn't even know were there." Something flickered across his face, an emotion I couldn't quite read. And for a second I thought he might kiss me. Instead, he bumped his shoulder against mine and said, "We should get back before we freeze to death." But as we walked back to the dorms, he kept his arm pressed against mine the entire way, and I knew I wasn't imagining what was happening between us. December arrived with finals and the looming winter break, and I realized I didn't want to go 3 weeks without seeing Miles. We'd become such a constant in each other's lives that the thought of being apart felt physically painful. The night before we were both supposed to leave, Miles texted me at 11 asking if I was still awake. I was, obviously, because I'd been lying in bed thinking about him instead of sleeping. He showed up at my door 10 minutes later with 2 energy drinks and a bag of chips. "Couldn't sleep," he said by way of explanation. My roommate grumbled something and put a pillow over his head, so Miles and I took our contraband snacks and went to the common room at the end of the hall. We sat on the old couch that had definitely seen better days, and Miles immediately curled into the corner, pulling his knees up and looking younger than his 20 years. "I don't want to go home," he admitted quietly. I knew his relationship with his parents was complicated, that they had expectations for him that didn't quite match who he was becoming. "It's only 3 weeks," I said, even though 3 weeks felt like an eternity. He looked at me with an expression I'd never seen before, vulnerable and uncertain. "Will you text me? Like every day?" The fact that he even had to ask made my chest ache. "Of course I will, Birdie." I said it without thinking, using his nickname for me as if it could be his too, and his eyes widened slightly. Then he laughed, but it was soft, almost tender. "That doesn't work as well for me." "No," I agreed, my heart pounding. "You need your own." We stayed up until 3 in the morning, talking about everything and nothing, And somewhere around 2, I started calling him Compass, because he'd told me once that he felt lost most of the time. And I wanted him to know that he helped me find my direction, even if he couldn't find his own. He got quiet when I explained it. And then he smiled this smile that made my entire body feel warm. "Birdie and Compass," he said. "I like that. That's just ours." The way he said ours made it sound like we were something, like we belonged to each other in a way that went beyond friendship. And I had to look away before he could see everything I was feeling written all over my face. Winter break was exactly as hard as I'd anticipated. I texted Miles every day, sometimes just stupid memes or complaints about my family, sometimes longer messages about what I was thinking or feeling. He always responded, and our conversations had a different quality over text, more honest somehow, like the distance made it easier to be vulnerable. One night, about a week into break, he sent me a message at midnight that just said, "I miss you, Birdie." Is that weird? I stared at my phone for a full minute, my heart racing, before I typed back, "No, I miss you too, Compass." He replied immediately, "Good." I was worried it was just me. I spent the rest of break analyzing that exchange, wondering if missing someone could mean what I desperately wanted it to mean. I'd accepted by then that I had feelings for Miles that went way beyond friendship, but I had no idea if he felt the same way, or if I was reading too much into every interaction. The nickname thing felt significant, felt like it meant something. But maybe that was just wishful thinking. Maybe he saw me as his best friend and nothing more. And I was going to ruin everything by wanting more than he could give me. When we got back to campus in January, Miles was waiting outside my dorm when my parents dropped me off. He helped me carry my stuff upstairs, and the whole time we were both grinning like idiots. And I realized that 3 weeks apart had clarified something I'd been trying not to acknowledge. I was in love with him. Completely, undeniably in love with my best friend who called me Birdie and let me call him Compass, and maybe, possibly, hopefully, felt the same way about me. We fell back into our routine easily, but everything felt different now, charged with possibility. Miles seemed more tactile than before, always finding reasons to touch me, to sit close, to exist in my space. One afternoon in late January, we were studying in his dorm room, and he just casually rested his head on my shoulder while reading his textbook, like it was the most natural thing in the world. I froze for a second, then forced myself to relax, to accept this new level of closeness, even though my heart was trying to beat out of my chest. "Is this okay?" he asked quietly, not moving. "Yeah," I managed. "More than okay." I felt him smile against my shoulder, and we stayed like that for over an hour. And it was one of the best hours of my life. February brought Valentine's Day, which I'd never cared about before, but suddenly felt loaded with significance. Miles and I didn't talk about it, but I caught him looking at me strangely a few times in the days leading up to it, like he was trying to figure something out. On February 14th, I went to my afternoon class and came back to find a small package outside my dorm room with a note in Miles's handwriting that just said, "For Birdie." Inside was a small enamel pin in the shape of a bird in flight, delicate and perfect. I held it in my hand and felt my eyes getting hot because it was the most thoughtful gift anyone had ever given me, and I knew, I absolutely knew, that Miles felt something for me, beyond friendship. I found him in his room an hour later. His roommate was out, and Miles was sitting at his desk, looking nervous in a way I'd never seen him. "Did you get it?" he asked immediately. I held up the pin, which I'd already attached to my jacket. "I love it," I said honestly. "Miles, He stood up quickly, cutting me off. "I need to tell you something, and I need you to let me say it all before you respond, okay?" I nodded, my mouth suddenly dry. He took a deep breath not quite meeting my eyes. I've been calling you Birdie for months now. And at first it was just a random nickname, but it became this thing that was ours, you know? And then you started calling me Compass. And I realized that we were creating this language that belonged just to us, and I... He paused, finally looking at me, his eyes vulnerable and scared and hopeful all at once. I'm in love with you, Nathan. I have been for a while now, and I don't want to just be your friend anymore. I want to be yours in every way you'll have me. I couldn't breathe. I literally forgot how to breathe for a second because Miles, beautiful, complicated Miles, had just said everything I'd been too scared to say. Say something, he pleaded when I didn't respond immediately. Please, Birdie. Say something. The nickname broke through my paralysis, and I crossed the room in 2 steps, cupped his face in my hands, and kissed him. He made this small, surprised sound, and then he was kissing me back, his hands gripping my shirt, pulling me closer. It was perfect and terrifying and everything I'd imagined, and nothing like I'd expected, all at once. When we finally broke apart, both breathing hard, I pressed my forehead against his and whispered, I love you too, Compass. I've been trying not to for months. He laughed, this beautiful, genuine sound of relief and joy, and kissed me again. We're idiots, he said against my lips. We could have been doing this for months. We were figuring it out, I said. We needed the nicknames first. Needed to create our own language before we could say what we actually meant. He pulled back to look at me, his eyes soft. Birdie and Compass. Ours, I confirmed, and kissed him again because I could now. Because he was mine, and I was his, and we'd found our way to each other through a nickname that meant everything. That was 4 months ago. We're together now. Actually together. And everyone on campus has figured it out because we're not exactly subtle about it. Miles still calls me Birdie, especially in private moments when it's just us. And I still call him Compass when he's feeling lost and needs reminding that he's exactly where he's supposed to be. Our friends think the nicknames are cute. And they are. But they don't know the full story. They don't know that those names represent the journey we took to get here. The way we created something that belonged only to us before we were brave enough to claim each other completely. Last week, Miles and I were lying in his bed, tangled up in each other in the way we are most nights now. And he traced the bird pin I still wear every day. You know what I realized? He said quietly. What? I asked, running my fingers through his hair. You were always trying to fly away, and I was always lost. But somehow we found each other anyway. Somehow you became my home and I became yours. I kissed his forehead, his nose, his lips. That's because you called me Birdie, I said. You gave me a name that made me feel seen, and I couldn't help but fall in love with you. He smiled against my mouth. Best nickname I ever came up with. Best thing that ever happened to me, I corrected, and I meant it. The nickname was where it started, but it led us to something so much bigger than either of us expected. It led us to each other, to this love that feels inevitable and right and completely ours. Total_char_count 16,847